So good morning, everybody. So nice to see you all. Hopefully, everybody's wide awake and ready to hear about assessment today. My name is Amy Bladen Shatto, and I'm from Leadership Variations. And actually, today's host is going to be Gail Anderson, my partner in crime from Leadership Variations. And today, myself and my other partner in crime for 30 years now, Dr. Charley Morrow, who's shaking his hand
Hi,
in
everybody.
fright that he's my partner. But we're going to do a session on assessments and making sense of assessments. How do you choose? Charley, do you want to do a real quick introduction of yourself?
Oh, sure. Charlie Morrow. I'm an industrial psychologist like Amy. And they don't let you out of graduate school until you've taken about 5 courses in assessments and measurement and those kinds of things. So I'm happy to share that as it's been developed and patinaed over the, I don't know, 25, 30 years that we've been doing this work. So it's good to see everybody. And my practice is all about assessment for development or assessment for like selection or decisions. In fact, I have a little practice in partnership with Leadership Variations called ta-da, the Talent Assessment and Development Advisors.
Love it. Thank you, Charley. And Gail, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Good morning. I don't think it's afternoon for anybody, but if it is, good afternoon to you as well. As you can see here, and for those of you who have attended these sessions before, very similar in the format, we're going to have a slightly longer facilitated presentation today, 30 minutes or so. And during that time, we do welcome you to ask questions or put your questions and thoughts in chat. We'll be monitoring that so that whether we answer the question immediately or come back to it toward the end, when we have 15 minutes or so set aside for some reflection and Q&A, we'll take care of all of those at that time. I do invite you right now to put your name and your email in the chat. Part of this is so that you can get to know each other as well. Perhaps there's somebody in the call that you'd like to reach out to have some further discussion and network with. And possibly, if you think of this now, how are you using or possibly struggling with the use of assessments within your organization? So if you would do both of those things, name, email, and should you have a thought on using or struggling with assessments, share that with us as well. Of course, as you know already, and it's stated here, this is being recorded, and we're going to be sharing that with you within the next couple of days after this program ends. So with that, let me turn it back over to Amy.
Thank you, Gail. So one real quick, there's so much we can talk about with assessment. We probably could have 7 sessions on this or more, but just to give you a sense of narrowing down the focus for today, since this is Leadership Live in 45. The idea in terms of making sense of assessments is today's session is not about what's my favorite assessment, because I bet if I went around to everybody would have a different sense of, oh, I like the DISC, I like the Hogan, I like the Berkman, and everybody has their favorite one, and Charley and myself included. But today is really about the criteria for assessments. How do we choose, and what helps us look at the criteria? So we're going to talk about that. And when we get to the question and answer and the sharing of your opinions, we're going to ask you to really focus in on what helps us make the decisions depending on the why of what your decisions are. And so that's what we're going to have to focus on. So yes, we'll talk about some of the assessments and everybody will smile and think, oh, I love that one. And we'll have some examples. And I will share with you, as promised in the advertisements, a tool that Leadership Variations has and has been giving out with our proprietary thoughts about what tools have pros and cons, and they all have pros and cons. But this one is really to think about making those decisions based on your needs. So I just wanted to throw that one out. And unless there are questions, and please feel free to ask those, but otherwise I'm going to turn it over to Charley to get us started.
All right. Well, it's really cool seeing everybody's comments pop up in the chat. some people commenting on how they're hearing doubts on assessments and the real science behind them. Some people saying, gosh, how do I choose an assessment for the talent cycle ahead? We love that. And for some, it's just a hobby, and that's cool, but let's keep going on this. And, you know, as we've worked with assessments over the years, Amy and I have started to see if there's major use cases for them. And I just want to share one way of thinking about this, because there's a ton of assessments out there. As a matter of fact, if you want, you can look and see the Bureau's annual handbook of mental measurement, which lists, I don't know, 3,000 assessments each year, and you can go back and look at that assessment that book going back 100 years, and it has all sorts of information. But just to think about some buckets that we might use as talent professionals, as development professionals, as coaches, we've got sort of a 4-bucket framework. So the first one is kind of engagement and framework. And I wouldn't minimize this, right? In getting people to engage in themselves and think about themselves. We have this innate curiosity, but having a way to engage and think about yourself is an awesome thing. In fact, it might even be the first step on developing, because you start to look at yourself in the mirror, if you will, like a Cosmo quiz, or maybe it's a little more in-depth assessment. You look at yourself really clearly and you say, there's something there I don't like. And then that gives you something to work on. So engagement and insights, one bucket. Another one is communications development. And this is, you have a team together, everybody does a shared assessment, they share it, and they learn something about each other. Maybe they learn something about themselves in the context of their social interaction. So we think that that's a really important category of assessment, and a legitimate one. These are all legitimate. Leadership and behavioral coaches. I know coaching, we have a lot of coaches in the room. Having a solid assessment that helps you think about yourself in a framework, in a methodical way, and think about the behavioral implications and how you might change that, how it might affect how you're seen by others, is a very important category. And then the last one is decision support or decision outcome support. So imagine you're making a decision on hiring somebody, and you want to make sure that they've got a personality that's a reasonable fit to the job, or they'll actually be motivated to do the job, or they will have the sort of mental abilities necessary for that job. So those are the sort of 4 buckets to think about. And in this presentation, we're going to try to cover the waterfront and think about these, because many times we learn about assessments earlier in our career, or even late in our career, and we start to think about them in a box. And we're trying to open that box up a little bit and make sure that we're inclusive. Would you add anything, Amy, to that, or Gail?
I think it's great.
Sounds good.
All right.
So I don't know if folks know this, but last time I looked, which has probably changed since then, there's 5,000 at least assessment instruments in the market, which is just frightening to think about. So how do we choose? I'm sad to tell you right off the bat, if you're coming here for a formula, there is no silver bullet. Bottom line, though, is all assessments are not created equally. They all have different pros and cons. And anyone who tells you that we got the perfect assessment, there's no cons, ours does everything. It's perfect. Walk away. No, run. So what you want to ask yourself is, does this assessment meet what you are trying to do with your interests? So some questions you're going to ask yourself, and these are not all the questions, these are just some of the basic ones, is the degree to which the tool is psychometrically solid. How complex is the tool? How much training and experience is required to administer or deliver the tool? Of course, how expensive? And what is the context that the tool is for your organization? And then what is the need for a specialized tool? So some tools are for overall, all of the different behavioral characteristics, and some might be pinpointed for certain characteristics. And we're going to look at some of these in more depth on the next slide. But the point is, and really what the key here is, your why determines which tool and how much or how many of these factors are really going to matter. And I really want you to think about it, because no matter what someone's telling you, all or some of these are going to matter to some or lesser of an extent. I don't know if you guys are hearing it, but I think somebody might be off of mute. So can you all just check and make sure that everyone's on mute so we can all hear? So let's take a little bit more of a deep dive into those possible whys for your uses of the tools. Number one, and the one everyone's always seems to be struggling on, the one I think Charley and I hear a lot about, how psychometrically valid or reliable is the tool. So now these are not the best or the most comprehensive definitions of these, but let's just take it. These are the simplest that I can say right now. How valid is a tool means, does the tool measure what it's supposed to, the construct that it's supposed to measure? And how reliable is it? Does it measure the same thing time after time? If you do it over and over again, will you get the same results? So a lot of people come and say, well, I want to use the most statistically valid and reliable tool. And generally, you're not going to get an argument from psychologists like Charley and I. We tend to lean in that direction, yes. But the reality is, this is a sliding scale. It's a blend of art and science. And some of my clients will know that I also have the reality as a business in my mind, and the concept of a minimum viable product. What do you really need in this concept? We can use simpler tools, particularly when we're making less decision making, when we're requiring less rigorous legal defense. Now, I'm not at all telling you you don't have to have a reliable or valid tool. I'm saying it's a sliding scale, and there are decisions that you have to look at. So that's number one. Number two is, what is your context in the company? Are you using it as a program? Are you pairing it with other tools? This is going to affect how and when you choose your tool. If you're pairing, for example, how are they going to blend? Like, one of the things we always talk about, if you're doing a personality or trait type of an instrument, it might make sense when you're looking on the inside, which those do very well, might make sense to blend this with a personality. With a 360 tool, which is looking very nicely from the outside in. How do others look at the person? So look at that blend. Now, this is another one, and some people might smile here, but are some tools already highly credible? Is this okay for your why? I know one of my clients is on the phone right now, and her organization loves the disc. And while that might not be a highly valid and reliable instrument, it has tremendous credibility. And depending on what the use is, are we having discussions and opening up the opportunity for leaders to talk and get their understandings of strengths and needs out there for development? That might be very okay. So why force the Hogan on them? It depends. And moving on to where it may depend on, what level are they at? Are these first line leaders? That disc might work great for them. Whereas for executive audiences, maybe not. And here's another one Charley and I often smile at: appetites. Charley told me about a company that said, when he asked, what does success look like for assessments? And they said, if I can take it in 15 minutes. And we scratched our heads and said, okay, this is going to be a challenge, because they were a group of more executive types, and we needed a more valid and reliable instrument. So that was an interesting one. And then, are you targeting overall or specialty skills? One of the ones that Gail will recognize, a couple of years ago, we were working with a women's leadership program, and we chose a 360 that was targeted at women in particular, a very wonderful proprietary 360 that was valid and reliable for women. And this made sense. Another one I use is the Genos 360, which is specifically for EQ. And this made sense when someone's being hired for political savvy. And finally, mastery level needed. No certification versus internal certification versus You need to hire that expert. Bottom line, considering the assessment partner for the higher stakes, legally related decision. So I'll just leave it at that and move on for Charley.
So I guess I'm the guy putting out the buckets today, the framework. So here's another framework to think about. For assessments that we would use, there's sort of a leadership styles assessment, which really gets to what your tendency is or your preferences. And that's a little different from a personality assessment. You could almost call it a personality or a traits assessment, because that measures things that endure over time. So leadership styles, more of a preference. It's sort of, I lean this way, but I can change. I can vary a lot. Personality is something that endures over time, or cognitive abilities generally thought to endure over time. 360s, which is another point of view, particularly important for leaders or people working in organizations, how you're seen by others. And then teams assessment, which is how you view the team that you're on and how do others view the team that you're on. So they all look at different features of an organization or a person, and they all matter and they're all distinct. So we're sort of, again, broadening the palette to say, don't just think about DISC, think about how could a 360 fit in, or how could a personality or trait assessment fit into all of this?
Did you add anything, Gail? Because I know you're familiar with a lot of these.
Right. Again, I think it just depends on getting down to the nitty-gritty of what are your goals, right? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to learn from the assessments, and determining which one or various ones are the best for your organization or that group.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to show you a few examples, and I really want you to keep in mind, these are literally examples out of thousands that are out there. So we're just throwing out what might be examples of each of the types that Charley went through. So the first one is the styles assessment. And if you think about it, it answers the question, what are my preferences or tendencies? It is not, and people will argue with me up and down, but my opinion, my expert opinion, and you can argue because this is art and science blended together, but my opinion is that this is not a personality inventory. It is looking at what my preference is because it is behavioral. It is something that I can modify and change based on what I hear and what I prefer. And what I prefer today may be very different than what I prefer even tomorrow. So what I feel today may change tomorrow. And you might see things like the DISC, the social styles or behavioral styles, and the Clifton Strengths Finders. And what you typically find in some of these is that they kind of categorize you into one of four buckets. That's the typical a typical examination of any of these styles inventories. There's tons of them. There's, I show up as a moose on my animal style. There's the color coded this, and there's that. And some of them are much more complicated than others. There's, as you see on the right side, the MBTI, which happens to be a favorite of mine. And I know one of my partners on the phone is also quite interested in using this. And there's no goods or bads here. It's how the person is using this, but this one puts you into a framework that helps you look at your decision making and how you, I'm not going to go into the details of it. I'll just say I will call the MBTI somewhere in between a leadership styles and a personality assessment. So I'll leave it at that, but that is the first of the four buckets that we talked about. And I'm going to let Charley move on.
So Amy, with this bucket,
sorry. Yeah.
For this bucket, what would you say is a use case for these leadership styles inventory? Is it like the sweet spot for them?
Question. Yes. Well, there are lots of sweet spots. And number one for me is when you're doing a workshop. So you're doing a workshop and you want to do communications and help people really understand, how can I understand the folks that I'm working with and really get to alter the way I'm working and become more understanding and self-aware of not only my style, but their style so that I can make changes um, based on what I know how they work. So I'm going to just throw out social styles or behavioral styles for a second. Hopefully, some of you are familiar with the amiable, the expressive, the driver, and the analytical. Well, the driver expects that they can just approach someone in their style, which is okay, chop chop. Let's just jump into the work, and we're going to do the work right now. Whereas somebody who's more expressive wants to have small talk and get together and be friendly. And when these two styles get together, based on what their interests are, one is feeling a little bit run over and feeling like, wow, that person's really rude. When in fact, it has nothing to do with rudeness. It has to do with what their values are. One is valuing task related information, and the other is much more interested in valuing the people related side of this. And so that's just one pole of those two boxes, the four boxes that I mentioned. So typically what you see with these is that there's two poles, and that the two poles form the four boxes. And you can see that, wow, I need to alter myself. You're not asking the other person to alter. You're figuring out, wow, I understand why that person is the way they are. I can really change how I approach that person. That's what we call it, a preference. I prefer this way, but Charley prefers that way. So I can really approach him differently to make a difference. Does that make sense, Charley?
I love the way you said that. I love that. Awesome. So let's talk about traits or personality now. So, this is, and by the way, full disclosure, I also facilitate for Hogan sometimes, so I have a bias here. Here we're moving into probably more rigorous assessments of something that's enduring over time. So we talk about personality, which is enduring. You can change a little bit, but your natural tendency is to go back to that your personality, whatever that is. So in many ways to measure it, for example, the Big Five is a open access assessment that covers the Big Five. It's free. The report's not that great. The Hogan, which I'm a big fan of, all sorts of fancy reports actually measuring the Big Five, but little variation there and some additional stuff mixed in. And then tests like the Watson Glaser, which is a cognitive ability test. We think of it, problem solving, your ability to identify assumptions and detect arguments and draw conclusions. Do you have the horsepower, general intelligence? So, the sweet spot for these are sort of really behavioral coaching, where you're really working deeply on something, or you're making a decision on someone. Do we hire this person? Do we promote this person? Those kinds of things. You can use it for workshops. For example, literally, you can have a workshop around the Watson Glaser because it provides dimensions of intelligence, what you're strong at, what you're not strong at, and you can work on those things. But at the core, these are more in-depth assessments. They're probably more expensive or might take more time to complete. And so there's an investment there. You want to make sure that you're really using it for high leverage opportunities. So.
And I would add, first of all, I'm also a Hogan freak. That's probably one of my favorite assessments as well. And I do that probably the most in my practice. But I would say that Hogan really is designed for psychologists, and people love it, but it requires a tremendous amount of time to get trained to use it. It is very complex. It's a wonderful tool, but it really does require a lot to get trained up. So that's the downside to it. And then in terms of Watson Glaser, it can't be I always say this. There is downside, and I should say it has that adverse impact. As a threshold, it's fine, but it can't be underestimated that it does show that people of color have always scored lower. We don't know why, but statistically, it is a fact. And in today's, environment, we need to take into consideration whether this is something that we're willing to use, that we want to use, regardless of the result that we get in terms of predictability in our battery for how well someone's going to perform on a assessment battery. 360, I started to mention this one, oops, sorry, before. I think a lot of you are probably using 360s or have seen 360s. This answers the question, how do others see me? If the other ones are more self-assessment or looking inwards as how do I see my traits or my preferences, and that way, this is more going outwards and having a variety of other folks rate my traits and skills. Rating my behaviors, my measurable, observable behaviors. Now, the person will also rate themselves here, and there's a comparison made between the two. But this is much more outside in, and yeah, so this is the 360, and there's a couple of them mentioned here. So we have benchmarks, which is the CCL gold standard in 360s. We have Talent-telligent. If some of you know the Lominger from the old days, the card sorts and that, Talent-telligent is the new one. It actually does it by level. So you now can look at managers and senior leaders and executives. Very interesting new approach. There are specialty 360s. I mentioned earlier, women in leadership and Genos. And a very common way that the 360 is done for higher level executives is with the verbal 360, all with interviews and done live. Well, a downside may be anonymity, but you don't find that being a super big downside if you're talking about executives. Anything you would add here, Charley?
No, other than to say I'm a big fan.
Right.
In terms of motivating people, it seems like 360 really touch a nerve with people. Gosh, I'm really seen that way. Huh, I need to look at my leadership style here, more so than the other assessments in my experience.
Excellent. Charley, take it away.
All right, so let's talk about team assessments. These are really looking at the interactions between the team, teamwork in a sense, and whether the team is, demonstrating behaviors that make it effective or not. Many people are familiar with Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. Pretty quick assessment. There's actually a free online version there's a free version out there. You can pay Lencioni's group to do their assessment. You can also get much more in depth, like the task 3. We're a big fan of that. It's much more rigorously developed on the rocket model, and it provides all sorts of guidance. But at the end of the day, these team assessments are really helping the team leader, as well as the members of the team, look at the team, understand the team, and think about how they could be different. So I've developed very rigorous assessments for teams. I've used these assessments. It depends on how deep you need to go and how much you want to tease it apart. And in fact, I have a very inexpensive one I'll share with anyone. Just email me afterwards, reach out to me on LinkedIn, called the Grippy Assessment, that looks at kind of the nuts and bolts, the tackling of, are there clear goals, and do we have good interaction? So there's lots of team assessments out there. They serve a lot of the same purpose, which is helping the team think about itself, think of how that core organizational structure works together. That's what I got.
Thank you, Charley. So not one size fits all. Lots of information here, and literally we've covered a huge amount of what's out there. But really, the bottom line here is your why for including the assessment. Are you looking at fun, casual team bonding, self-insights? And like Charley said, it's not, don't dismiss that one right off the bat. Are you doing team workshops and building a common language for communicating better as a team? Are you doing the deeper coaching for changing behaviors and action planning? Are you doing executive coaching? Are you making legally required recommendations around selection, hiring, or promotion? And all of these things have different implications and are going to require different criteria in choosing your assessments. Now, Based on these, ask yourself, how psychometrically sound are these going to have to be? Who is your target audience? Do we have the budget? And we really didn't touch on this a lot, but obviously they're all going to cost a different amount and you have to assess, do we have the budget for it? And part of it's going to be, do we have to find the budget? Because if we're going to make legal decisions, we have to find the budget for the right assessments, because we can't take a risk of being sued ultimately. And maybe there's an MVP approach that we can do that's okay, but we still have to find that budget to do that. Does it make sense to leverage a partner for the situation when there's critical legal implications? There's not enough time to master a tool. And we didn't talk about this much, but to preserve confidentiality, sometimes having an external can really do that confidentiality bit when it doesn't make sense to have inside people doing coaching. You really want to have an external perspective to preserve the confidentiality, even when it could have been preserved. It's that perception. And as we know, perception is reality. Gail, Charley, anything to add to this one before we turn it?
I think we're good.
Okay. So we want to come back to, oh, actually, Charley, you take this one.
Yeah. So, we started with a question, how are you using assessments? What are you struggling with? And I just wanted to open up the conversation a little bit around that. And some of the things that came up were things like, I'm looking for the one best assessment, for our organization or across the talent cycle, I think is how I heard it. Some other comments. And I was just wondering, what remains in your mind? What questions are you still thinking about? What questions are on your mind?
Why don't I put it back to the gallery view so we can all see each other? Is that okay?
And while people are pondering, I noticed there was just very recently more of a comment, but it could be worth, might be a question, in there somewhere where it states, and I think this was from Kevin. Yes. I always thought that Lencioni was only good for sales teams because was his experience. Is that something that you want to just comment on in terms of its validity for other types of groups and uses? Because
I'm
that could
happy
be a
to do that.
struggle people have
Yeah,
in
I can
making a
answer that
decision,
as
right?
well. Charley, you take it and I'll add some color if you like.
Sure. I think Lencioni's great, particularly at getting at things like trust for all kinds of teams, right? So it could be a leadership team. We've used it with leadership teams. It could be a sales team. I think we've also used it with sort of product development, kind of software development teams, just by way of illustration. So we like the Lencioni assessment. And if we were to, it helps you understand, it helps the team to understand itself, helps you as a facilitator understand the team as a coach. And it's really focused on how do we interact with each other. And there could be other aspects of teamwork that are important also.
I would say it's definitely not limited just to sales. I mean, the big issue that Lencioni seems to get to is getting to a built commitment. So it's that underlying, how do we get to the steps that build up to a commitment? So yeah, I don't think there's anything in it that says it only has to do with sales. And I've seen it very effective. Again, Lencioni for me has been really in the case of the workshops and working together for building communication. I've used it, and I think they recommend even in combination with the MBTI and some other tools. That's where I think it's been most effective. But I think it can be a really good tool in that context. But if you're looking for something that's really going to dig in and have a forward plan for, okay, so now that we have the results about our team, what can we do now to go forward? It doesn't provide the same type of forward leverage that something like the TAS would provide. TAS has a book, it's called Ignition, and it gives you an entire field guide of 40 exercises that says, okay, if you're low on mission, here are 4 exercises that you and your team can do to build on that. So it's a different type of an assessment. I think I rambled past the question, but hopefully that's helpful. What else? Joseph.
Joseph,
Hi, is it okay if I just jump in?
Of course.
free for all.
Um, I was wondering if you could ramble for a few minutes about using assessments in small organizations. For context, I've mainly worked with nonprofits and startups, the headcount between 10 people and 50 people. And
L-
I have a very superficial knowledge of industrial organizational psychology. I've taken one course in that field. Um, but it always kind of struck me that there are challenges when you have such a small sample size, um, or in general, just smaller organizations. And I don't have a concrete or detailed question, but I was wondering if there are any thoughts that arise that you'd like to share relating to small organizations making use of selection for promotion, for selection. Um, yeah, take it away.
Well, you answered the first question that I was going to ask, which is what's your why? You said selection or promotion. I will add a little bit of a probe here. Is it what level is it for in the company? Are you looking at senior executives? What specifically are you looking to do with it?
Oh, I think for me, this is kind of more of a broad general question, but scenarios I've had in the past have mainly been looking at selection in terms of hiring, um, like low level and mid level staff. I've never been involved in a hiring process for C-suite or executive level. But if I am involved in that at some point, I would definitely want to know how could I make use of, assessment tools rather than just putting together a structured interview.
Right, right. Um, I have some thoughts, but Charley, do you want to take it first?
So I'm working with a small organization right now, not 10 people, but some people would call it small, 40, 50 people. And their executive directors really focused on, I want to make sure that we're being clear on every hire, that we're not just making biased decisions. And so she's asked that they do an assessment, more looking for red flags than anything else. I'll also say that, boards sometimes have a difficult time figuring out their criteria and what to do about hiring, say, an executive director for a small nonprofit. And there's a great place there for the insights that you can gain from more rigorous assessments and read out.
Does that answer the question?
I have a question. I still get stuck. I'm a neuropsychologist, but I sort of respecialized. My original graduate work, I took all the measurement courses in from Ron Downey and all the IO folks at Kansas State. So I have a little more than just a neuropsych. But here's something I always get caught on. So I'm licensed. It's the old licensed issue combined with the sliding scale of validity. I did lots of court work. I was an expert witness, and so I'm just super sensitive to that. So when I I understand the sliding scale, and I understand something that may not be quite as high up on the validity scale is popular, and I'm certified in Hogan. I know it's much easier to understand than the Hogan. I get all that, and I agree with it, but I still get stuck. If I'm doing something about human behavior, then the state I live in says I'm practicing psychology, and so how do I justify something that is less valid, which some might say less accurate, even though it's easier to talk about? I feel like I run into a wall there because I still have people that basically the customer says, I want the disc, or I want MBTI, or I want, and I feel like I get stuck because having been in court, 100 times on different issues, I can't get over that wall of an attorney saying, and putting words in my mouth, but saying, so if this is less accurate, why did you use that?
Ty, that is the question of the day.
I know.
And
I started not to
thank
ask.
you. No. And when a client says they want it as a consultant, we very much are required to, we show what the pros and the cons are. We explain what the purpose of the tool is, what it can and cannot do. I personally, and Charley, I'm going to let you weigh in also, but I would not work I wouldn't take on a disc for selection, because I would see that as a potential for I would tell an organization that it's not used for that, and that's a misuse of the tool. I'd very much try to recommend something else. I would explain what other things we could do. I may work on, can we try using a battery, but I would be remiss to use a tool that it doesn't have I mean, there's just a lot to be said. If there is some art and science to it, like the MVP approach that I talked about before, when we're designing something from scratch and we're using content validity rather than criterion related validity, that's a different thing in terms of an approach from scratch. But taking an actual tool that doesn't have the right validity to use something, I would be remiss if I actually did that with a client, and I would work very hard to help them understand the whys. And I haven't actually had someone, I want to use this for selection. I've not had that problem once I properly educated and worked with them. Charley, can you weigh in on that one?
I'll weigh in. It's just a tough situation, Ty, but you got to tell the person you're liable, or I'm liable if I make that. I can't do. I won't do it. Sorry.
Yeah.
That would be my guidance.
Yeah. Thank you. I am shocked. I'm looking at our time. Oh my gosh, that went fast. But it is Leadership Live in 45. We could talk about this for a long time. I hope this has been the beginning of helpful for folks. Charley and I are willing to have private calls to move on with anybody who wants to. And I will send out the deck with my contact information, and we will be happy to meet with anyone who would like to take this further and talk and brainstorm with us. So we're happy to do that. Gail is going to put a link into the box, which has the tool that I mentioned, and it's going to have lots and lots of those tools. And remember that it is our opinion, because we have given a rating of the tool, and we've definitely explained why, but it is our opinion. It's art and science. So please look at it, and we will give an opportunity to join a newsletter that'll come out quarterly, in which we add more advice on assessments, and we will give you an opportunity to have the list updated and more tools added. And you can always request, hey, can you add this tool to the list? Because there's 5,000 more to add. So Gail, if you would be so kind as to put that in there.
I put it in about a minute ago. So
thank you.
In case people had to drop. If you need it again, happy to add it.
This is recorded session. So you can look for it. I will have it on Leadership Live on my website, and I can provide it for those who would like to see it again. And are there any last minute thoughts? Charley, anything you want to say at this point?
No, other than a question came up on the TKI we didn't get to. So contact Amy and I about that. But I don't have a quick answer for like a workshop.
No, but we'll answer it. We can certainly talk about it. I've used it.
It's a great assessment. All right. Have a great afternoon. I feel like we've got this thing going. We should keep going, but I'm sure people have other commitments.
But that's the foot in the door, toe in the water. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.